Jake Morrison felt the ship shake under his feet as another blast hit the hull. The USS Liberty was dying and he knew it. Smoke filled the corridors while red lights flashed everywhere. His crew ran past him carrying wounded soldiers and broken equipment. The alien ships outside looked like giant glass butterflies, but they hit harder than anything he had ever seen before. Morrison grabbed his communication device and called to all sections of the ship. His voice was calm even though his heart was beating fast. He told everyone to get to the escape pods right now. Some of his officers looked at him with surprise. The standing orders were clear about what to do when facing the Zephyrian fleet. They were supposed to ram the enemy flagship and take as many aliens with them as possible. That was the Earth Command way. That was what heroes did, but Morrison looked at the faces around him and saw young people who wanted to live. He saw Lisa Hayes, who had just gotten married last month. He saw Danny Chun, who talked about his little sister every day. He saw Maria Santos, who was saving money to buy her parents a house. These were not just soldiers to him. They were people with dreams and families and futures. The ship computer spoke in its cold voice. It said the chance of survival was only 12% if they abandoned ship. If they rammed the enemy, the computer said 73% of the enemy fleet would be destroyed. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about all the medals and honors that Earth Command gave to dead heroes. He thought about how they would write his name in the history books if he followed orders. Then he opened his eyes and looked at his crew again. He made his choice. Morrison ran through the burning corridors, helping people get to the escape pods. The metal walls were so hot they burned his hands when he touched them. Pieces of the ceiling fell down around them. The artificial gravity kept going on and off, making everyone float and then crash back down. But Morrison kept moving and kept helping. He found 3 engineers trapped under a fallen beam. Morrison and 2 other soldiers lifted the heavy metal. Off them, 1 engineer had a broken leg, but she was still alive. They carried her to Pod 7. Morrison checked his list and saw that 847 people were on the ship when the attack started. He was going to save every single one of them. The Zephyrian ships kept firing their strange blue weapons. Each blast made the Liberty shake more. Morrison could hear the hull cracking in some places. The engine room was completely gone now. The life support systems were failing section by section. But the escape pods were still working. Morrison helped load the last group of wounded soldiers into Pod 15. He looked around the pod bay and counted again. 846 people were now safe in pods ready to launch. Only 1 person was left, himself. He walked to the final pod and stopped. Through the small window he could see the Zephyrian ships waiting. Their blue weapons were charging up for another attack. Morrison knew they would probably shoot at the escape pods too. Some of his people might die anyway. But at least they had a chance now. At least they could fight another day or go home to their families. Morrison climbed into the last pod and sealed the door. He pressed the launch button and felt the pod shoot away from the dying ship. Behind him, the USS Liberty exploded in a ball of fire and light. The ship he had commanded for 3 years was gone. His career in Earth Command was probably gone too. But 847 people were alive. The escape pods scattered in different directions. Morrison had programmed them to head for different safe systems. Some went toward Earth, others went to the outer colonies. His pod and 12 others were heading for a mining world called New Dakota. It was far from the main shipping lanes, and the Zephyrians probably did not know about it. As his pod flew through space, Morrison thought about what he had done. Earth Command would call him a traitor. They would say he was a coward who ran from battle. They would probably put his picture on wanted posters. But when he closed his eyes, he could still see the faces of his crew. He could still hear Lisa Hayes laughing at something Danny Chun said. He could still remember Maria Santos showing him pictures of her family. The pod computer told him they would reach New Dakota in 6 days. Morrison looked out at the stars and wondered what would happen next. He had saved his people, but he had also changed everything. There was no going back now. He was no longer Lieutenant Commander Morrison of the Earth Fleet. He was just Jake Morrison, and he was running toward an unknown future on a world he had never seen. The pod was small and Cold. Morrison had enough food and water for the trip, but not much else. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Liberty exploding. He saw the Zephyrian ships with their strange blue lights. He wondered why the aliens had attacked them. The two species had been fighting for 10 years now, but Morrison had never really understood why the war started. On the fourth day, Morrison received a message from one of the other pods. It was Lisa Hayes. She told him that her pod and 6 others had made it safely to the Centauri system. She also told him that Earth Command was already calling him a deserter. They were saying he had betrayed humanity and helped the enemy. Morrison was not surprised, but it still hurt to hear. As New Dakota got closer, Morrison could see it was a red world covered in dust and rocks. There were small settlements scattered across the surface. Mining equipment and transport ships moved between them. It looked like a hard place to live, but it also looked peaceful. Maybe he could disappear here and start over. Maybe he could find some other way to fight the war that made sense. The pod landed with a hard bump in the desert outside the main settlement. Morrison gathered his few belongings and stepped out into the red dust and thin air of his new home. He did not know that this world held secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about the war between humans and aliens. 6 months had passed since Jake Morrison landed on New Dakota. The red dust had gotten into everything he owned. His clothes were stained brown and his hair felt gritty all the time. But he had found work in the crystal mines, and the miners did not ask questions about his past. They called him Jake and treated him like any other worker who had come to this hard world looking for a fresh start. Morrison lived in a small metal building on the edge of Red Rock Settlement. The building had been empty for years before he moved in. It had 2 rooms and a water recycler that worked most of the time. At night, he would sit outside and look up at the stars. Sometimes he wondered what his old crew was doing. Sometimes he tried not to think about them at all. The work in the mines was dangerous, but simple. The miners used plasma cutters to break apart the crystal formations that grew deep underground. The crystals were worth a lot of money on Earth because they were used to make computer chips and energy cells. Morrison had learned to spot the good crystals from the worthless ones. He had also learned to stay quiet when the other miners talked about the war. Most of the miners hated the Zephyrians. They said the aliens were trying to take over human space and kill everyone. They said Earth Command was doing the right thing by fighting back hard. Morrison never argued with them, but he wondered if they would feel the same way if they had ever seen a Zephyrian ship up close. The aliens were strange, but they did not seem evil to him. One day Morrison was working deep in Mineshaft 7 when his plasma cutter hit something that was not crystal. The tool bounced off with a bright flash and left a black mark on what looked like metal. Morrison called for his partner Tony Garcia to come look. Tony had been mining on New Dakota for 15 years and had seen everything. Tony scratched his beard and looked at the metal surface. He said it was part of an old ship that had crashed here long ago. The crystal had grown around it over many years. Tony said miners found old ship parts all the time, but most of them were just human vessels that had gotten lost. Morrison asked if they should report it to the settlement boss. Tony laughed and said the boss did not care about old junk as long as they kept finding good crystals, but Morrison was curious. He spent his lunch break using a smaller cutter to clear away more crystal from the metal surface. After an hour of careful work, he found what looked like a door or hatch. The metal had strange symbols carved into it that he did not recognize. They were not human writing, and they were not Zephyrian either. That evening, Morrison went to the settlement library and used the computer to search for information about the symbols. The library computer was old and slow, but it was connected to the Earth data network. After 2 hours of searching, Morrison found something that made his blood turn cold. The symbols matched records from an ancient archaeological site on Mars. Earth scientists had found similar markings in caves that were millions of years old. But the strange part was that the same symbols had been found on 12 different worlds across human space. The symbols were always in places that looked like they had been hidden on purpose. Morrison printed out the research files and took them back to his small home. He read them 3 times before he understood what they meant. The symbols were not made by humans or Zephyrians. They were made by something else, something that had been in the galaxy long before either species had learned to travel between stars. The next morning, Morrison went back to Mineshaft 7 with a portable scanner he had borrowed from the equipment shed. He told Tony he was checking for gas leaks, but really he was scanning the hidden ship. The scanner showed that the vessel was much larger than they had thought. Most of it was buried under tons of crystal, but Morrison could see the outline of something as big as a space station. Morrison worked alone during his lunch breaks for the next 2 weeks. He cleared away more crystal and found more doors and hatches. Behind one door he found a room full of strange machines that still had power after all these years. Behind another door he found what looked like a laboratory with equipment he did not recognize. But the most important discovery was in a room that looked like a command center. Morrison found computer files that were still readable. The ship computer had been recording everything for thousands of years. As Morrison downloaded the files to his scanner, he began to understand the terrible truth. The ship belonged to a Zephyrian exploration vessel that had crashed on New Dakota 3,000 years ago. But the files showed that the Zephyrians were not exploring, they were running. They were fleeing from something they called the Devourers. The files described the Devourers as creatures that could take over the minds of other species and use them as weapons against each other. Morrison read about how the Devourers had destroyed dozens of civilizations by making them fight wars that served no purpose except to weaken both sides. The files showed that the current war between humans and Zephyrians had all the signs of Devourer manipulation. Both species were being pushed to fight harder and hate more, while some third party watched and waited. The Zephyrian files also contained bioscan data from the last days before their ship crashed. The scans showed that several members of their crew had been infected by Devourer parasites. The infected crew members looked normal, but their brain patterns were different. They were being controlled by something else. Morrison compared the brain scan patterns to recent photos of Earth Command leaders that he found in the news feeds. The match was perfect. Admiral Richard Barnes, who had been leading the war effort against the Zephyrians, showed the same brain patterns as the infected Zephyrian crew members from 3,000 years ago. Morrison felt sick as he realized what this meant. The war that had killed millions of humans and Zephyrians was not real. It was being orchestrated by parasites that wanted both species to destroy each other. Some of the most powerful leaders on both sides were not even in control of their own minds anymore. Morrison copied all the files to his personal storage device and tried to figure out what to do next. He could not go to Earth Command because their leadership was compromised. He could not contact the Zephyrians because he had no way to reach them, and they would probably shoot him on sight anyway. He was just one man on a mining world in the middle of nowhere with information that could change the course of the war. 3 days later, Morrison got his answer when an Earth Command patrol ship landed at Red Rock Settlement. The ship was small and fast and carried a crew of 12 soldiers in full combat armor. Morrison watched from his home as they set up a command post in the settlement center and began asking questions about new arrivals. Morrison packed his few belongings and the precious data files into a backpack. He slipped out the back of his building and headed into the desert. Behind him, he could hear the soldiers going door to door looking for someone. He did not need to guess who they were looking for. As Morrison walked across the red sand toward the mountains, he wondered how Earth Command had found him so quickly. Then he remembered the library computer and his searches for information about the symbols. Someone had been watching those searches. Someone knew he had found something important. Morrison looked back at Red Rock Settlement one more time. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from his old home. The soldiers were probably burning it to destroy any evidence. But they were too late. Morrison had the files and he knew the truth. Now he just had to figure out how to use that truth to save both species from the real enemy that was controlling them. Jake Morrison had been hiding in the crystal caves for 2 weeks when the Zephyrian ship landed in the desert above him. He watched through his scanner as the strange butterfly-shaped vessel settled onto the red sand with no sound at all. Morrison had never seen one of their ships up close before. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Morrison grabbed his rifle and checked his ammunition. He had stolen the weapon from an Earth Command supply depot 3 days ago, along with food and water. The soldiers were still hunting for him across New Dakota, but they had not thought to look in the old mining caves. The caves were dangerous because of gas pockets and unstable crystal formations. Most people stayed away from them, but Morrison had been studying the ancient Zephyrian files he had found. The files contained maps of the cave systems and instructions for avoiding the dangerous areas. The crashed Zephyrian crew had lived in these caves for months before they died. Now Morrison was following their path through the underground maze. The Zephyrian ship had landed directly above the main cave entrance. Morrison wondered if this was an accident or if they knew about the ancient crash site. Either way, he was trapped. The only way out was through the entrance they were guarding. Morrison decided to wait and see what they would do. Through his scanner, Morrison watched 4 figures leave the Zephyrian ship. They were tall and thin with skin that looked like it was made of silver metal. They wore no armor or weapons that he could see. Instead, they carried devices that looked like scientific instruments. One of them was clearly the leader, because the others followed wherever it went. The Zephyrians moved toward the cave entrance with purpose. They seemed to know exactly where they were going. The leader stopped at the entrance and held up one of its devices. Morrison could hear strange clicking sounds coming from the entrance area. The aliens were definitely looking for something specific. Morrison made a decision that could get him killed. He walked out of his hiding spot with his hands raised high above his head. His rifle was slung across his back where they could see it but also see that he was not threatening them. The Zephyrians turned toward him with movements that were too quick and smooth to be human. The leader stepped forward, and Morrison got his first close look at a Zephyrian face. Their eyes were large and dark like pools of oil. Their mouth was small and moved in ways that seemed wrong. But when the leader spoke, its voice was clear and somehow familiar, even though it was speaking a language Morrison did not understand. Morrison pulled out his scanner and activated the translation program he had found in the ancient files. The program was old, but it worked well enough for basic communication. Morrison said hello and told them his name. The Zephyrian leader tilted its head and responded in what the translator said was surprise. The leader said its name was Zara 9 Crystals, and that it had been tracking Morrison for days. Morrison asked how they knew he was here. Zara pointed to the cave entrance and explained that they had been monitoring human transmissions for months. They knew about the ancient crash site and they knew that someone had been accessing the old files. Morrison realized this could be his chance to learn the truth about the war. He asked Zara why the Zephyrians had attacked human ships for so many years. Zara made a sound that the translator said was similar to laughing. She said the Zephyrians were not attacking humans. They were trying to warn them about the real enemy. Zara explained that every time a Zephyrian ship approached a human vessel to share information about the Devourers, the humans would attack first. The Zephyrians had been forced to defend themselves, but they never wanted to fight. They had been trying to make contact with someone in the human government who was not infected by the parasites. Morrison showed Zara the files he had copied from the ancient ship. Her reaction told him everything he needed to know. She made sounds of excitement and called to the other Zephyrians. They gathered around Morrison and looked at his scanner with what seemed like hope. Zara explained that her people had been searching for the lost ship for centuries. The ship contained the last free records of Zephyrian history before the Devourer infection spread through their government. Most of their leaders were now controlled by the parasites, just like the human leaders. The war was serving the Devourers. By weakening both species, Morrison asked what they could do to stop the Devourers. Zara said they needed to find the uninfected leaders on both sides and show them proof of the parasitic control. The first they needed to rescue the people who were about to be killed because of Morrison. Morrison did not understand until Zara showed him her scanner. Earth Command forces were moving toward Red Rock Settlement with heavy weapons. They were planning to destroy the entire town to eliminate any evidence of what Morrison had discovered. 3,000 innocent miners and their families were going to die to protect the Devourer's secret. Morrison and the Zephyrians raced back to the settlement in their ship. The Zephyrian vessel moved faster than anything Morrison had ever experienced. They covered the distance in minutes instead of hours. But when they arrived, they could see Earth Command dropships already landing around the settlement. Morrison watched through the ship windows as soldiers in power armor surrounded the mining town. The settlers had no weapons that could fight back against military-grade equipment. Men and women were running through the streets trying to get their children to safety. Morrison recognized many of the faces. These were people he had worked with and lived among for months. Zara asked Morrison what he wanted to do. She said her people could not interfere directly without starting a larger war, but they could provide support if Morrison was willing to fight for the innocent people below. Morrison looked at the soldiers preparing to attack his friends and made his choice. Morrison asked Zara to give him weapons and equipment that could level the playing field. Zara and her crew worked quickly to outfit Morrison with Zephyrian technology. They gave him armor that was light but stronger than anything Earth Command used. They gave him weapons that could disable the power armor systems without killing the soldiers inside. Most importantly, they gave Morrison a communication device that could broadcast on all frequencies across the galaxy. If he could gather enough proof of the Devourer infection, he could share it with everyone at once. No government could stop the truth if it reached every person in human space at the same time. Morrison also asked for one more thing. He wanted Zara to come with him. He explained that humans would never believe a message that came only from him. But if they saw humans and Zephyrians working together to fight a common enemy, it might change everything. After thousands of years of manipulation, maybe, the two species could finally see past their artificial hatred. Zara agreed, even though it meant risking her life in a battle that was not originally her fight. She said the Devourers had been using fear and hatred to control both species for too long. It was time to forge a new tool that could cut through their lies and deception. Morrison checked his new weapons and looked down at the settlement where Earth Command soldiers were preparing their attack. He thought about all the innocent people who were about to die for a war that had been built on lies. He thought about his old crew and all the soldiers on both sides who had died believing they were fighting for their people. Morrison looked at Zara and her crew. A few hours ago they had been enemies. Now they were allies in a fight that was bigger than any one species. Morrison realized that this was what the Devourers had been trying to prevent. When humans and Zephyrians worked together, they were stronger than the parasites could handle. The time for hiding and running was over. Morrison was going to save the settlement, and then he was going to save both species from the creatures that had been feeding on their hatred for so long. The axe was forged and ready to fall. The rescue of Red Rock Settlement had been a complete success, but Jake Morrison knew it was only the beginning. He and Zara 9 Crystals had managed to disable the Earth Command soldiers without killing anyone and then broadcast the truth about the Devourer infection across 12 star systems. The response had been immediate and devastating. Morrison watched the news feeds from the hidden base that Zara had helped him establish in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Half of the human fleet was in rebellion against Earth Command. Colony worlds were declaring independence. Families were splitting apart as some believed the infection evidence while others called it alien propaganda. The Zephyrian government was facing the same chaos. Zara had contacted the free members of her species and shared the ancient files Morrison had discovered. Now Zephyrian ships were fighting each other in space while their homeworld burned with civil war. What had started as an attempt to save both species was tearing them apart from the inside. Morrison felt responsible for all the death and destruction. Lisa Hayes sent him messages from her ship saying that former friends were now trying to kill each other over whether to believe Morrison or follow Earth Command orders. Danny Chun was leading a group of uninfected officers, but they were being hunted by Admiral Barnes and his loyal forces. Maria Santos had been captured and was probably being tortured for information about Morrison, but the worst news came from Earth itself. Morrison received a coded transmission from his parents who were still living in the house where he had grown up. His father, Carl Morrison, was a retired admiral who had served with honor for 30 years. His mother, Susan Morrison, was a doctor who worked with veterans who had been injured in the war. Both of them were trying to help their son by speaking publicly about the devourer evidence. The transmission was only 10 seconds long, but Morrison could see the fear in his parents' eyes. His father said that Earth Command agents were watching their house. His mother said they were being called traitors for supporting their son. The message ended with both of them saying they loved him and believed he was doing the right thing. Then the transmission cut to static. Morrison tried to contact his parents, but their communication system was no longer responding. Zara helped him access Earth surveillance networks, and what they found made Morrison sick with worry. His childhood home was surrounded by Earth Command security forces. His parents were being held prisoner in their own house. Morrison knew this was a trap, designed to make him do something stupid. The infected leaders wanted him to try a rescue mission so they could capture or kill him. But Morrison could not abandon his parents. They were in danger because of his choices. He had to find a way to save them without walking into an obvious trap. Zara suggested using a team of volunteers from both species to rescue Morrison's parents. She had been recruiting uninfected humans and Zephyrians to join their cause. They called themselves the Free Coalition, and their numbers were growing every day. But Morrison knew that a large rescue operation would be detected before it could succeed. Instead, Morrison decided to use the one advantage he still had. Most people in Earth Command still thought of him as a traitor who was working with alien enemies. They did not know that he now had access to Zephyrian technology that was far more advanced than anything humans had developed. Morrison could get close to his parents if he was very careful and very lucky. Morrison used Zephyrian cloaking technology to hide a small ship as it approached Earth. The ship was designed to look like space debris on Earth sensors. Morrison piloted the ship himself while Zara monitored communications from their base. If the mission went wrong, Zara would broadcast the complete Devourer files to every person in the galaxy. The truth would survive even if Morrison did not. The flight to Earth took 18 hours. Morrison spent the time thinking about his childhood and all the good memories he had with his parents. His father had taught him to fly when he was 12 years old. His mother had helped him with his homework every night until he graduated from school. They had always supported his dream of joining the space fleet even when other parents said it was too dangerous. Now, Morrison was using everything his parents had taught him to fight against the government they had served their entire lives. He wondered if they understood that the Earth Command they had known was no longer in control. The people giving orders now were puppets of an alien species that wanted to destroy humanity. Morrison landed his ship in the forest behind his parents' house. The area had not changed much since he was a child. He could see the old tree where he used to climb and the creek where he used to catch fish. But now there were Earth Command soldiers hiding in positions throughout the woods. Morrison counted at least 20 armed guards between him and the house. Morrison activated his Zephyrian armor and weapons. The armor made him nearly invisible, and the weapons could disable the guards without killing them. Morrison moved through the forest like a ghost. One by one, he stunned the guards and left them sleeping in the bush. They would wake up in a few hours with headaches but no permanent damage. The house itself was more heavily defended. Morrison could see guards at every window and door. There were also scanning devices that would detect him even with Zephyrian cloaking. Morrison needed a different approach. He decided to use the old storm drain that connected to the basement. He had played in those tunnels as a child, and he still remembered the way. Morrison crawled through the narrow concrete tunnel for what felt like hours. The tunnel was full of water and mud and things he did not want to identify. But eventually, he reached the basement of his childhood home. Morrison carefully moved the metal grate that covered the tunnel entrance and climbed into the basement. The basement looked exactly the same as when Morrison was young. His mother still had boxes of his old toys and school projects. His father still had his collection of model spaceships on the shelves. Morrison felt like he was traveling back in time to a simpler world, where the biggest problem was getting good grades in school. Morrison climbed the stairs to the main floor and heard voices coming from the kitchen. He recognized his parents' voices, but they sounded tired and scared. Morrison also heard at least two other voices that belonged to Earth Command officers. Morrison checked his weapons and prepared to face whatever was waiting for him. Morrison entered the kitchen and saw his parents sitting at the table where they had eaten thousands of meals together. They looked older than he remembered, and there were lines of worry on their faces. Two Earth Command officers were standing nearby with their weapons drawn. Both officers had the strange look in their eyes that Morrison had learned to recognize. As signs of devourer infection, the infected officers turned toward Morrison, but they moved too slowly. Morrison stunned both of them before they could fire their weapons. His parents looked at him with surprise and relief and fear all mixed together. Morrison hugged them both and told them they needed to leave immediately. But as they were preparing to escape, Morrison heard his best friend, Pete Collins, calling his name from the front yard. Pete was now a captain in Earth Command, and he had brought a full squad of soldiers to surround the house. Morrison realized that Pete was not infected, but he still believed that Morrison was a traitor who was working with alien enemies. Morrison looked out the window and saw Pete standing in the yard with his weapon ready. Pete was calling for Morrison to surrender and face trial for his crimes against humanity. Morrison knew that Pete would never understand the truth about the Devourers. Pete had always been too trusting of authority and too loyal to the military system. Morrison made the hardest decision of his life. He told his parents to escape through the back door while he distracted Pete and his soldiers. Morrison walked out the front door with his hands raised and faced his oldest friend. Pete looked relieved to see Morrison, but also sad that it had come to this. Morrison tried to explain about the Devourers and the infected leaders, but Pete would not listen. Pete said Morrison had been brainwashed by alien propaganda. He said Morrison was a disgrace to everything they had sworn to protect. Morrison realized that Pete would rather believe his friend was evil than accept that everything he had fought for was a lie. The standoff lasted for 10 minutes while Morrison tried to convince Pete to look at the evidence. But then Morrison heard gunfire from behind the house. His parents had been caught trying to escape, and Earth Command soldiers were shooting at them. Morrison forgot about Pete and ran toward the sound of the guns. Morrison arrived just in time to see Pete running after him and stepping directly into the line of fire from an infected Earth Command officer who was aiming at Morrison. Pete took the blast meant for his friend and fell to the ground with smoke rising from his chest. Morrison knelt beside Pete and tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Pete looked up at Morrison with eyes that were growing dim. He whispered that he was sorry for not trusting his friend. He said he was starting to understand that maybe Morrison had been right about everything. Then Pete stopped breathing and Morrison lost the last connection to his old life. Morrison carried Pete's body inside while his parents waited by the back door. The infected officer who had killed Pete was now advancing on all of them with a smile on his face. Jake Morrison stood before the massive portal that connected the Devourer home dimension to normal space. The portal looked like a wound in reality itself, with purple light bleeding through the edges. Around him were 12 other portals, just like it, scattered across 17 different star systems. Each portal had a team of Free Coalition volunteers ready to destroy it. Each team knew this was probably a one-way mission. Morrison checked his equipment one final time. The Zephyrian dimensional weapons were charged and ready. His armor was functioning perfectly. The communication device that linked him to all the other teams was working. But most importantly, the ancient Zephyrian technology that might allow them to escape back to normal space was untested and might not work at all. Zara-9 crystals stood beside Morrison, adjusting her own weapons. Over the past year, she had become more than an ally. She had become the closest friend Morrison had ever known. They had fought together through dozens of battles against infected forces from both species. They had saved each other's lives so many times that keeping count was impossible. Morrison looked around at the rest of his team. There were 6 humans and 6 Zephyrians, all volunteering for a mission that would probably kill them. Lisa Hayes had insisted on joining, even though Morrison had tried to talk her out of it. Danny Chin was there along with Maria Santos, who had escaped from Earth Command prison 3 months ago. The others were people Morrison had met during the long fight against the Devours. The plan was simple, but extremely dangerous. Each team would enter their portal and fight through the Devourer defenses to reach the dimensional anchor that kept the portal stable. When all 13 anchors were destroyed at the same time, the portals would collapse and trap the Devourers in their own dimension forever. But anyone still inside when the portals collapsed would be trapped there too. Morrison had spent weeks studying the ancient files about Devourer technology. The creatures lived in a dimension where different physical laws applied. Time moved differently, matter behaved strangely. Most importantly, the Devourers fed on negative emotions like hatred and fear. The more their victims fought and suffered, the stronger the Devourers became. That was why they had manipulated humans and Zephyrians into fighting each other for so many years. Every battle and every death had made the parasites more powerful. The infected leaders on both sides were not just puppets. They were food sources that grew stronger as they spread more misery and conflict. Morrison activated his communication device and checked in with the other 12 teams. All teams reported ready. Lisa Hayes was leading the team at Portal 7. She told Morrison that Earth Command and Free Human Forces were still fighting in the space around her portal, but her team was ready to proceed. Danny Chun reported similar battles around Portal 3. The most dangerous portal was Portal 1 near Earth itself. Admiral Barnes and a full fleet of infected ships were defending it. The team assigned to Portal 1 consisted entirely of Zephyrian volunteers because they had the best chance of fighting through the heavy defenses. Morrison had wanted to take that portal himself, but Zara convinced him that Portal 13 was just as important and needed his leadership. Morrison gave the order and all 13 teams entered their portals simultaneously. The transition from normal space to the devoured dimension felt like being torn apart and put back together wrong. Morrison found himself floating in a space that was filled with purple fog and strange, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The devoured defenders appeared almost immediately. They looked like shadows with too many teeth and eyes that burned with hunger. But the worst part was that some of the defenders wore the faces of people Morrison recognized. He saw Pete Collins advancing toward him with weapons that dripped black poison. He saw Admiral Barnes leading a squadron of infected soldiers. He saw his own face twisted into an expression of pure hatred. Morrison realized that the Devourers were using the memories and fears of their victims as weapons. Every person who had been infected or killed by the parasites could be recreated here as a tool of war. Morrison forced himself to remember that these were not real people. They were just echoes and shadows designed to break his spirit. Zara fired her weapons at the shadow creatures and they dissolved into purple smoke. But more kept appearing to replace them. Morrison and his team fought their way through waves of fake enemies while searching for the dimensional anchor. The anchor was supposed to be a massive crystal structure that channeled energy between dimensions. Dosa and Morrison checked his communication device, but the signal was weak and full of static. He could barely hear reports from the other teams. Lisa Hayes was fighting through what sounded like an army of shadow creatures. Danny Chen reported that his team had found their anchor, but it was heavily defended. 3 teams had already gone silent. Morrison's team reached a vast chamber, filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with dark energy. At the center was the dimensional anchor. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. The crystal was taller than a building and surrounded by floating platforms where real devourers waited to defend it. The real devourers were worse than Morrison had imagined. They looked like giant insects made of living shadow with wings that seemed to be made of pure fear. When they moved, they left trails of darkness that made Morrison feel hopeless and angry. When they spoke, their voices sounded like everyone Morrison had ever failed or disappointed. The battle for the dimensional anchor lasted for what felt like hours. But Morrison's armor computer said it was only 20 minutes. The Devourers fought with weapons that attacked the mind as much as the body. Morrison found himself reliving every mistake he had ever made and every person he had failed to save. But Zara and his team helped him stay focused on the mission. Morrison finally reached the base of the crystal anchor and placed the dimensional charges that would destroy it. The charges were based on ancient Zephyrian technology that could disrupt the quantum fields holding the portal open. But Morrison had to hold the activation switch for 30 seconds while the charges built up power. During those 30 seconds, the Devourers threw everything they had at Morrison. They showed him visions of his parents being tortured. They showed him Pete Collins dying over and over again. They showed him every member of his crew from the USS Liberty calling him a coward and a traitor. Morrison held onto the activation switch and tried to remember why he was fighting. Zara appeared beside Morrison just as a massive devourer creature lunged at him with claws that could tear through his armor. She threw herself between Morrison and the creature and took the full force of its attack. Morrison watched in horror as Zara fell to the ground with purple poison spreading through her silver skin. Morrison wanted to help Zara, but he could not let go of the activation switch. The charges needed 15 more seconds to reach full power. Zara looked up at Morrison and told him to complete the mission. She said that saving both species was worth any sacrifice. Then she closed her eyes and stopped moving. Morrison felt rage and grief flooding through him, but he realized that was exactly what the Devourers wanted. They fed on negative emotions, and his anger would only make them stronger. Instead, Morrison focused on the positive memories he had shared with Zara. He remembered their first meeting in the caves of New Dakota. He remembered working together to save Red Rock Settlement. He remembered all the lives they had saved by fighting together. The charges reached full power and Morrison released the activation switch. The dimensional anchor exploded in a burst of light that tore through the purple fog. Around the chamber, the devourer creatures began screaming as their connection to normal space was severed. Morrison grabbed Zara's body and activated the emergency escape device she had given him. Morrison felt reality shifting around him as the escape device tried to punch a hole back to normal space. For a moment, he was falling through endless purple darkness while the dimension collapsed around him. Then suddenly he was floating in normal space near the wreckage of the portal that had once connected to the Devourer realm. Morrison checked his communication device and heard reports from the other teams. 11 of the 13 portals had been successfully destroyed. Lisa Hayes reported that her team had escaped, but Danny Chun and 4 others were still missing. Maria Santos confirmed that the Earth portal was gone and Admiral Barnes was no longer responding to any communications. Morrison looked down at Zara in his arms and realized she was still breathing. The purple poison was fading from her skin, and her eyes were opening. The ancient escape technology had somehow healed the damage the Devourers had caused. Morrison felt relief and joy flooding through him as Zara smiled and told him the mission was a success. Over the following weeks, Morrison watched as the galaxy began to heal from years of artificial conflict. Without the Devourers to maintain their mental control, the infected leaders began to recover their true personalities. Admiral Barnes was found in his quarters on Earth with no memory of the past 3 years. He immediately ordered a ceasefire with all Zephyrian forces. Morrison and Zara worked together to establish peaceful contact between the human and Zephyrian governments. Both species had suffered terribly from the manipulated war, but they were eager to build a better future together.